sort it out. If you don't want to waste the time, could you please start with somebody else?
Yes, we can start the panel. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Garcia. I'm the chair of this panel on authoritarianism and the people. First of all, I just wanted to thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon after a few days of intense conference. So thanks for joining us. We're gonna have 4 presentations, but we're actually missing the 4th presenter. We're gonna follow the program and see if she can join us in a minute. We have the first presentation with Sergio Schargel. Is that your last name, Sergio? Did I pronounce it right?
Well, it's a bit confusing. We even don't know for sure. It's something like Schargel. They changed it to avoid deportation during the Second World War. So.
Okay, so we're gonna start with Sergio. He's from Sao Paulo University. I will give you all 15 minutes for presenting, if that's okay, so we can have half an hour for a discussion. And I'll interrupt you and give you a warning after 13 minutes, so you know that you have 2 minutes left. Of course, I wanted to ask you to be on time because I feel that sometimes the most interesting questions come up, during these 30-minute debate, so we want to make sure we have enough time for that. So Sergio, if you're ready, we can just get started with your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Well, first, good morning to everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event, to come back to Helsinki after so many years, if only in virtual mode. Well, my name is Sergio. I'm a PhD candidate in São Paulo University in Literature and PhD candidate in Political Science at Federal Fluminense University. Well, this communication is the direct result of my researches. In my master, I researched similarities and differences between integralism and Bolsonarism discourse in relation to Mussolini's discourse. And now in the PhD, I'm researching the relationship between the Jewish community with Jair Bolsonaro, their support or rejection. I will talk briefly about integralism and Bolsonarism. Sorry, can everybody hear me well? Yes, oh, thank you. Well, despite the global democratic recession, which had its 14th consecutive year in 2020, according to Freedom House, some political scientists watched with surprise the victory of Jair Bolsonaro in the 2018 elections, an openly anti-democratic candidate. But what authors such as Leonardo Ritter and points out is that Brazil was already facing a process of democratic fragility and erosion, and support for authoritarianism, whose initial milestone can be understood as the questioning that Aécio Neves, candidate defeated in the 2014 election, still about the results of it, hurting one of the most basic precepts of a democracy, the ability of adversaries to recognize themselves as legitimate. Well, a lot of ink has been used up in an attempt to explain the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018, and rightly so. How is it possible, with all the recent past of Brazil experiencing unprecedented economic growth and managing to reduce a very small but still part of its secular social problems, how it started to experience such a fast process of democratic erosion and closure of the civic space? How to explain that after 30 years of consolidation of its democracy, the country found itself again threatened with an authoritarian rupture? In early 2020, Brazil recalled with surprise that integralism, a political movement that emerged in the early 1930s and was openly inspired by fascism, despite having been fragmented, had not disappeared. After the broadcast of a film in Netflix featuring a Jesus Christ who supposedly had homosexual relations, some members of one of several contemporary integralist factions threw a Molotov cocktail at the company's production in an action that almost victimized a security guard. Supposedly, the same group vandalized the University Unirio by removing and burning anti-fascism flags raised by the students as well as threatening them. Plínio Salgado, integralism's founder, was openly inspired by Italian fascism when creating it, doing so after a meeting with Mussolini. Mussolini would even finance Plinio's integralism in its beginning. And until its self-exile with the persecution of integralism by the Estado Novo, or one could really translate to something like new state, it is not absurd to interpret integralism as being, in fact, a Brazilian version of fascism. Its nationalist aspects were the most notable, from the clothes that highlight colors from the Brazilian flag to the motto Anauê, which translates from the Tupi language to something like, you are my relative. As a reactionary, the movement sought to return to a supposedly glorious past, ranging from monarchy to even, and more strongly, Indianism. As an authoritarian, and following what was preached by Italian fascism, it asserted itself against democracy in its liberal format and in favor of what it meant by new forms of democracy. At this point, populism enters into a mixer with all the other concepts, considering that integralism inherits an anti-elite discourse similar to Italian fascism, suggesting that the power should be returning to the true Brazilians, a power that was distorted by corrupt elites linked to international communism or Judaism, depending on the internal current. If linked more to leaders such as Plínio, who was more linked to Italian fascism, or Gustavo Barroso, which was more linked to Nazism, and to restore national glory. As a popular movement, it spread through all sectors and social classes. In other words, integralism, like Italian fascism, projected itself as a third way, an alternative between communism and liberalism, which it saw as two heads of the same parasite. During the Estado Novo dictatorship, however, integralism, as well as the communists, were persecuted, and Plínio Salgado went to self-exile in Portugal. With the dissolution of Estado Novo and Plínio's return from self-exile, integralism enters a new phase. It does not have the same strength as before, when it reached 1 million followers in a country of 35 million people, and was the biggest fascist-inspired movement in Latin America. It is no longer an anti-Sicilian movement as before. On the contrary, it asserts itself in defense of the young and sharp Brazilian democracy. In other words, it is institutionalized through a political party, the PRP. In a way, it is not absurd to say that integralism was absorbed by the establishment, which would no longer tolerate, in the newly democratic and post-war scenario, openly fascist incursions, especially after Brazil joined the alliance. Plínio's speeches become less anti-Sicilian, less inflamed, less outsider, and more political. Although in the 2 decades that follow it continued with some fascist traits, its populism and its authoritarianism cooled down. His nationalism remained unchanged, however. He no longer preached, at least not so often, against the destruction of a political elite. In some ways, he became himself the political elite. The discourse against the head danger remains, and its authoritarianism returns with a sign of times when, in the early 60s, he supports the military coup. Well, following Plínio's death in the 70s, integralism was fragmented into several independent groups. Some are more extreme, associated with Nazi and anti-Semitic groups, some more restrained and claim to be democratic. One of these groups, the Nationalist Popular Insurgents Command, was responsible for the attacks on Unirio and Porta dos Fundos. Fragmented contemporary integralists were absorbed by other nationalist political parties and movements such as PRONA and Bolsonaro's party PSL. One of the terrorists on the attacks was affiliated to PSL. Another integralist activist is part of one of the government ministries. Integralist groups held marches and demonstrations in support of the Brazilian president, considered, and I quote, the least distant candidate from Christian and Brazilian values, embodied in the motto, God, Homeland, and Family. The same motto is currently used by Bolsonaro and was the same motto as well as Salazar in Portugal. Nevertheless, Bolsonaro is not a cause but a symptom. Extreme right-wing movements ranging from extreme nationalism to even Nazism have been gestating and gathering strength in Brazil for at least 20 years. Sainz, considered a hero by Bolsonaros, was elected with a record amount of votes in 2002 with 1.5 million votes. A researcher at Unicamp, Adriana Dias, record for an exponential increase in Nazism cells within the last decade in the country, accounting for at least over 300. But there was a lack of leader with populist appeal that needed not only focus on its nationalist circles. Thus, Bolsonaro emerges as an outsider despite his 30 years of politics and a well-established campaign strategy. He can not only create a mass movement and demonize his objective enemy, but also succeed in the support of fundamental sectors of the center and the traditional rights, from liberals to conservatives, even though he has never been both. Although not directly linked to integralism, Bolsonarism recycles traditional aspects of its predecessor. Even mottos are recycled. God, country, and family. As I said before, the motto of Bolsonarism originally appeared in integralism. Same goes for God above all. While Brazil above all can't fail to remember Deutschland über alles from Nazi Germany. His repeated quotes from Mussolini's sentence and phrases, his Ministry of Culture impersonating Goebbels, if they do not imply that Bolsonaro is in fact a Brazilian version of fascist, indicates at least a strong ideological approach. It is a fortuitous coincidence that Bolsonaro has Messiah in its third name. For Ristano of followers, he is in fact the incarnation of a Messiah, an image and rhetoric that the captain often makes use of. Considering the important part of his support coming from neo-charismatic religions, and as Silas Malafaia, a famous Brazilian preacher, stated in a well-known video, Bolsonaro is seen by the group as a chosen one of God to lead the nation to prosperity. He is not, therefore, just another leader, but the leader, the prophet who will supposedly apply the miracle of prosperity. Well, Jair Bolsonaro is a good example of Weber's image of exemplary prophet. However, he is a curious and outlandish example. Bolsonaro is the prophet of nothing. He does not have an exceptional trajectory, revolutionary ideas, or great deeds. On the contrary, his life and ideas are marked by the most simplistic mediocrity and Manichaeism. Bad military, in the famous words of former dictator Ernesto Geisel, and a deputy without preeminence for almost 30 years. Bolsonaro is, above all, a sign of times. A man who made himself available in the right time, who knew how to take advantage of a unique opportunity in his life, when the masses were desperate to return to Foucault's phrase for their domination. Thus, Bolsonaro embodies his time spirit. The messiah of a mediocre Brazil, the failure of millions projecting the format of hope on an individual. As a messiah, he is the only one capable of changing everything that is there, to return to a phrase he is often used. As he stated in his own even government program, symptomatic entitled Project Phoenix. He constantly expressed his frustration with the democratic breaks that prevents him from being totalitarian, as well as his attacks on the other powers that follow as the result. It is pertinent to think that in addition to democracy's counterattacks to Bolsonaro's anti-democratic impulse, perhaps the most efficient control tools have been, ironically enough, Brazil's own traditional authoritarian bases. The secular oligarchies in the provinces and their branches in the capital forced the president to make repeated concessions to the traditional political elite he himself promised to wipe out, in order to maintain himself until the end of his very term. In other words, he is becoming himself, at least for now, absorbed by the own political elite he ought to combat. This concession, however, gradually weakened him. Undoubtedly, Bolsonaro has lost a lot of his messianic aspect of 2018, proved to be more of the same considerable amount of his supporter, and runs the risk of not getting re-elected in 2022. Even though Bolsonaro is weaker now than he was when he sold himself as an outsider in 2018, he is still taken by a messiah, as the only one capable of leading the nation to greatness by a percentage of the faithful who, to what everything indicates, will remain practically unscattered regardless of what the Messiah does. For these people, Bolsonarism is a form of religious fundamentalism. Like Messiah, Bolsonaro is endowed with magic capable of working the necessary miracles. A form of mystical religion, therefore, to return to Weber, based on rationalism and the belief in the magical powers of the myth. To this supporter, Bolsonaro is a form of projection. Like other charismatic leaders, as has been said, Bolsonaro does not have exceptional qualities of leadership or intelligence. But it's precisely his insignificance that gives him strength. These million supporters see in him traces of themselves, traces of the often referred as the average Brazilian. In other words, his arrival as at the presidency allowed these millions.
Sorry, excuse me, 2 minutes left, okay?
Okay, thank you. Allow these millions of ordinary men to identify their sexism, their racism, their rudeness, their violence, when these categories become contested and questioned for the first time. Well, to conclude, Bolsonarism is the ultimate expression of a political of resentment, both for his part, for decades relegated to a supporting role, and for his followers. Although what has been said about his mediocrity seems a priori to contradict Weber's perception of charismatic domination, it is actually not the case. Weber says, and I quote, that by charisma one must understand a quality considered as extraordinary. And in fact, for those who are not part of the sect, there is nothing extraordinary about Bolsonaro. However, as he has already been debated, believers in Bolsonarism take him for a messiah. Its extraordinary quality, however paradoxically as I sound, is precisely its lack of qualities. This is what makes him stand out, which makes him assume the figure of prophet, of which the epithet myth, which he assumes, is symptomatic. After all, what is the myth? The myth is what is beyond reality, but it serves to explain reality. It's an amalgamation of the supernatural with the normal, the superhuman. Just to conclude, some quantitative data. Latino Barometer data collected in 2018 strengthens Bolsonaro's argument as the populist messiah available at the right time. The variable, the country governed for the benefit of an elite, in that file with the anti-elite discourse of populism, received an affirmative answer from the overwhelming majority of the sample, 90%. The same database reveals that the variable support for democracy, even though 40% still defended democracy as the best form of government, almost 15% admit authoritarian governments as possible, and 40% think it's indifferent. It is noticeable from this probability analysis considerable support from alternatives to democracy. Interestingly, however, a quick-scare test on the same basis revealed that there is no association between this anti-elite discourse and the variable support for democracy, although the same test revealed an association between the variable support for democracy and the variable the country's future economic situation. The less support for democracy, the greater the likelihood of pessimism about the economic future. No less interesting, another test revealed an association between variable support for democracy and political integration of the region. The less support for democracy, the greater the likelihood for an individual to be against political integration. Well, thanks to everybody. I don't think I still have time, right? Yes.
Not now, but we'll have some time for discussions here. So I actually have already a lot of questions.
Okay, thank you.
I'll talk to you later. Okay, we have the second presentation. It is Michelle Luz and Leticia Barón from Universidade Federal de Pelotas in Brazil, and they're going to talk about the role of nostalgia also in Brazilian far-right discourse. I believe you have a video, right, Michelle?
Yes, I'm trying to share it now.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Leticia Barón. I and my colleague Michelle Diana da Luz are going to present this paper, whose title is The Role of Nostalgia in Populist Far-Right Discourse in Brazil. Initially, we would like to introduce ourselves. We both are PhD students at Universidade Federal de Pelotas, which is a university in the south of Brazil. In our thesis, we both research the far-right discourse in our country, Brazil.
I cannot hear it. Can you hear the video?
Not anymore. In October of 2018, Jair Bolsonaro defeated the Workers' Party candidate on national election and became the Brazilian president. This unexpected victory included Brazil on the list of countries governed by a right-wing politician. So, considering this context, We want to explore how this discourse was built using the nostalgic feelings mobilized by the old days and the idealized perception of how it provides a sense of belonging through signifiers like religion, morality, tradition, and order, meanings more commonly articulated by a reactive discourses of the far right. We also bring to the discussion the relation between populism, identity, identification, and affection in a polarized political context as it is in Brazil in these days. So our presentation is going to be divided into 3 parts. In the first one, I'm going to develop what we understand about populism and political identification. Michelle is going to develop